Hello and welcome to the next edition of the Briefings Direct Voice of Innovation podcast series. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Intra Arbor Solutions, your host and moderator for this ongoing discussion on the latest insights into modern IT deployment architecture strategies. Container-based deployment models have rapidly gained popularity, from cloud models to corporate data centers. IT operators are now looking to extend the benefits of containers to more use cases, including the computing edge. Yet in order to push containers further into the mainstream, security concerns need to be addressed across this new end-to-end container deployment spectrum. And that means security addressed during development and deployment under the rubric of DevSecOps best practices. Stay with us now as we examine the escalating benefits that come from secure and robust container use with our guest. We're here with Simon Leach, Worldwide Security and Risk Management Practice, Hewlett-Packard Enterprise Pointnext Services. Welcome, Simon.
Hi, Dana. Good afternoon.
Glad you could join us. Simon, are we at an inflection point? Perhaps I overstated that containers are entering the mainstream. Maybe we're at just pre-mainstream, but is this a point where we're going to start to see containers take off? And why is this sort of this next level of virtualization, which we saw gain in popularity so much?
Well, we're certainly seeing a lot of interest from our customers when we speak to them about the best practices they want to follow in terms of rapid application development. One of the things that always held people back a little bit with virtualization was that you were always reliant on an operating system and managing the applications that sat on top of that operating system and managing the application code that you would deploy to that environment. But what we've seen with containers is that as everything starts to follow a cloud native approach and we start to deal with our applications as lots of individual microservices that all communicate integrally to provide the application experience to the user, that it makes a lot more sense from a development perspective to be able to address the development in these small microservice-based or module-based development approach. So whilst we're not seeing a massive influx of container-based projects going into mainstream production at the moment, there's certainly a lot of customers who are sort of testing their toes in the water to try and identify the best possibilities to adopt and address container usage within their own application development environment.
And because we saw developers grok the benefits of containers early and often, we've also seen them operate within usually a closed environment, not necessarily thinking about deployment. So is this now the time to get developers thinking a little differently about containers as not just perhaps a proof of concept or a test environment, but really thinking about it as ready for the mainstream?
Yes, and I think one of the challenges I've seen with what you've just sort of described is that a lot of container projects have started as a developer's project behind his laptop. So the developer's gone out there, he's identified a container-based technology as something interesting to play around with, and as time has gone by, he's realized that he can actually make a lot of progress by developing his applications using a container-based architecture. But what that means from the organizational perspective is it's often done under the radar of the execs or of management. So one of the things we're discussing with our customers as we go and talk about addressing DevSecOps and DevOps initiatives is make sure that you do get that buy-in from the executive team and you start to enable some top-down integration. So don't just see containers anymore as being a developer's laptop project, but start to look at it and start to understand how you can integrate that into the overall IT processes that your organization is operating with. And that does require a good level of buy-in from the top.
And I imagine this requires a life cycle approach to containers, thinking about not just the development, but how they're going to be used in over quite some long period of time. Now, 451 Research recently predicted that the market for containers will hit $2.7 billion by the end of this year. Why do you think that the operators, the people who will be inheriting these applications and microservices, will take advantage of containers? What does it bring to their needs and requirements beyond what the developers get out of it?
I think the biggest advantage I see from an operational perspective is the ability to make fast changes to your code that you're using. So whereas in the traditional application development environment, a developer would need to make a change to some code and it would involve requesting a downtime to be able to update the complete application. With a container-based architecture, you only have to update parts of the architecture. So it allows you to make many more changes than you would have previously been able to deliver to the organization. And it allows you to address those changes very rapidly.
And how does this allow for a more common environment to extend across hybrid IT from on-premises to cloud to hybrid cloud and then ultimately to the edge?
Well, the applications that are developed and the containers that are developed within a cloud-native approach are typically very portable. So you don't need to be restricted to a particular version of Linux, for example. The container itself will run on top of any operating system instance of the same genre. So obviously you can't run a Windows container on top of a Linux operating system or vice versa, but within the Linux space, they're pretty much backwards compatible across there. So it makes it very easy for the containers to be developed in one environment and then provisioned into a different environment.
And that portability extends to the hyper-scaling cloud environments, the public clouds. So is there a multi-cloud extensibility benefit?
Yes, definitely. And you see a lot of developers developing their applications in an on-premise environment with the intention that they're going to be provisioned into a cloud. And if they're done properly, it shouldn't matter if that's a GCP instance or an Azure instance or AWS.
Well, we have quite an opportunity in front of us with containers across the spectrum of continuous improvement, development, deployment across multiple different scenarios for deployment models. What are the challenges now that we need to think about this as a life cycle? What are the challenges to providing security and making sure that these containers are not going to add risk and in fact, improve the deployment efficiency and productivity of many organizations?
So when I address the security challenges with customers, I always focus them into two areas. So the first one is the business challenge of adopting containers and the security concerns and constraints that come along with that. And the second one is much more around the technology or the technical challenges. So if we start by looking at the business challenges or how we can address that to adopt containers securely, the first one is this cultural shift that I already mentioned a couple of minutes ago. If we're going to adopt containers, we need to make sure we've got the appropriate executive support, that we move past this concept that the developer is doing everything on his laptop, that we start to train our coders on the needs for secure coding. So a lot of developers, their main goals are to produce high quality software fast. And they're not trained as security specialists. So it makes a lot of sense to put a education program into place that allows you to train those internal coders so that they understand the need to think a little bit more about security, especially in a container environment where you've got this fast release cycle, and sometimes the security checks get missed or don't get properly instigated. So it's good to start with a very secure baseline. And I think once you've addressed the cultural shift, the next thing is to think about the role of the security team in your container development teams or your DevOps development teams. And I always like to try and discuss with my customers the value of getting a security guy into the product development team from day one. So very often we've seen in the traditional IT space that the application gets built, the infrastructure gets designed, and then the day before it's all going to go into production, someone calls security comes along and says, hey, have you done a risk assessment on this? And it ends up delaying the project. If you can introduce that security person into the small agile teams that you're building to deliver upon your container development strategy, it means that they can think together with the developers. They can start doing risk assessments and threat modeling right from the very start of the project. And it allows us to reduce the delay that you have with security testing. And at the same time, it also allows us to shift our testing model left. In a traditional waterfall model, testing happens right before the product goes live. But in a DevOps or DevSecOps model, it's much better to be able to embed the security and the best practices and the tooling right into the CI/CD pipeline. And then the last point around the business view is that, again, going back to the comment I made earlier, that developers are very often not aware of secure coding and how to make things secure. Providing a secure by default approach or even a security self-service approach to those developers, so delivering them with a secure registry, for example, that provides known good instances of container images, or providing infrastructure and compliance as code so that they can start to follow a much more template-based approach to security, starts to pay a lot of dividends in the quality of the software as it goes out of the door.
I see. And are we talking about the same types of security precautions with traditional IT people might be accustomed to now extending to containers, or is there something different about how containers are secured, whether it's at the operating system level or even at the network level?
Well, a lot of the principles are the same. So there's obviously still a need for network security tools. There's still a need to do vulnerability assessments. There's still a need for encryption capabilities. But the difference with the way you would go about using technical controls to protect a container environment is all around this concept of the shared kernel. So there's an interesting white paper that has been released by NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technologies in the US, SP 800-190, which is their application container security guide. And this really identifies there being 5 container security challenges. And this is around risks with the images, risks with the registry, the orchestrator, the containers themselves, and the host OS. So when we're looking at defining a security architecture for the customer, we always look at those risks within those 5 areas and try to define a security model that protects those best of all. But I think one of the important things to understand when we're talking about securing containers is that we've got a different approach to the way we do updates. So in a traditional environment, we take a gold image for a virtual machine, we deploy it to the hypervisor, then we'd realize there was a missing patch or there was an update that was required, and we'd roll that out using whatever patch management tool we use. In a container environment, we take a completely different approach. So we never update running containers. The source of your known good image is your registry. The registry is where we will update containers with updated versions of those containers, and we will use the container orchestration platform to make sure that next time somebody calls a new container, it's launched from the new container image. So it's important to remember we don't update things in the running environment. We always use the life cycle, the container life cycle, and involve the orchestration platform to make those updates. And that's really a change in the mind for a lot of security professionals, because they think, okay, I need to do a vulnerability assessment or a risk assessment. Let me get out my Qualys or my Rapid7 or whatever, and I'm going to scan the environment and I'm going to find out what's missing, and then I'm going to deploy patches to plug in the risk. So we need to really make sure that our vulnerability assessment process gets built right in to the CI/CD pipeline and into the container orchestration tools that we use to address that change in behavior.
It certainly sounds like those orchestration tools are playing a larger role in security management. Is that fair, that the organization or individuals who are in charge of the orchestration need to be thinking security, whereas perhaps in the past they didn't?
Yes and no. I mean, I think the orchestration platform definitely plays a role, and the individuals that will use that will need to be controlled in terms of making sure there's good privileged account management and there's integration into the enterprise authentication service. But there are a lot of capabilities built into the orchestration platforms today that make the job easier. A couple of examples. One of the challenges we've seen for a long time in software development is developers taking a shortcut and hard coding clear text passwords into text because it's easier. And that's understandable, right? You don't need to worry about managing passwords or remembering passwords. But what you'll see a lot of orchestration platforms offering is an ability to deliver secrets management. So rather than storing the passcode within the code, you now request the secret from the secrets management platform that the orchestration platform offers you. Another example, orchestration tools give you the ability to separate container workloads of differing sensitivity for your organization. So as an example, you would not want to run containers that operate your web application on the same physical host as containers that operate your financial application. Because although you've got the ability with a container environment using separate namespaces to separate the individual container architectures from one another, it's still a good security best practice to run those on completely different physical hosts or in a virtualized container environment on top of different virtual machines to provide that physical separation between the applications. And very often the orchestrators will give you the ability to provide that functionality within the environment without having to think too much about it.
Now, before we move on to talking about some solutions and best practices for bringing security early and often into the container development and deployment lifecycle, there's another new burgeoning area where containers are being used, and that's not just in applications and runtime environments, but also for data and persistence. And Hewlett-Packard Enterprise has been leading the charge on making containers appropriate for use with data in addition to applications. So how does the all-important security around data caches and different data sources have to enter into our thinking around the use of containers?
Well, again, because containers are temporary instances, it's important that you're not actually storing any data within the container itself. And at the same time, it's important that you're not storing any of that data on the host OS either. So it's important that you've got the ability to provide persistent storage on an external storage array. So looking at storage arrays, things like, well, from HPE, we've got Nimble Storage or FreePower or Primera. They've all got the ability through plugins to interact with the container environment and provide you with that persistent storage that remains even as the containers are being provisioned and deprovisioned. So your container itself, as I said, doesn't store any of the data, but a well-architected application infrastructure will allow you to store that on a third-party storage array.
Simon, I've had an opportunity to read some of your blogs, and one of your statements jumped out at me. Organizational culture still lags behind when it comes to security. What do you mean by that, and how does that organizational culture need to be examined, particularly in the use now of the increased use of containers?
Well, so that's going back a little bit to what I said at the start. It's about getting the security guys involved in the DevSecOps projects early on in the life cycle of that project. Don't bring them to the table towards the end of the project. Make them a valuable member of that team. There was a comment made, and I think it was by someone from within Amazon, although I may be wrong, about this idea of a two-pizza team, right? So a two-pizza team, what was meant by that comment was that a meeting room should never have more people in it than can be fed by two pizzas. And I think that applies equally to development teams when you're working on container projects. They don't need to be big. They don't need to be massive. But I always say, it's important to make sure there's enough pizza saved for the security guy. Because you need to have that security guy in the room from the beginning to understand what the risks are. And that's a lot of where this cultural shift needs to start to change. And again, as I said, executive support plays a very good role in making sure that happens.
Now, we've talked a little bit about people and process. There's also, of course, that third leg of the stool, the technology. Are the people building container platforms like HPE thinking along these lines as well? And you mentioned how orchestrators are already anticipating some of this. What does the technology and the way it's being designed bring to the table to help organizations be DevSecOps oriented?
There's a couple of ways that technology solutions are going to help here. So I think that the first space are the pre-production commercial solutions. So these are the things that tend to get integrated into the orchestration platform itself. So it's things like image scanning, it's secure registry services, it's secrets management. So a lot of those are going to be built in, hopefully, to any container orchestration platform that you choose to adopt within your organization. There are also commercial solutions that support similar functions, and I think it's always up to an organization to do a thorough assessment of whether their needs can be met by the standard functions in the orchestration platform, or if they need to look at some of the third-party vendors in that space, people like Aqua Security or Twistlock, who was recently acquired by Palo Alto Networks, I believe. Then you've got the solutions I would gather up as post-production commercial solutions. So this is more when you're looking at the runtime protection of the container environment, or maybe container forensic capabilities, or even network overlay products that give you the ability to separate your workloads at the network level and provide container-based firewalling, that sort of stuff. And you'll see that very few of these capabilities are actually built into the orchestration platforms, and they tend to be third parties, organizations like Sysdig or Guardicore or NewVector. And then you've got a third bucket of solutions, which are more around open source solutions. So these typically focus on a single function, but they do it in a very cost-effective way and typically very well. It's open source, community-led. And these are solutions like SonarQube, Claire, Falco, which is the open source project that Sysdig runs. You've also got Docker Bench and Calico, which is a networking security tool. But what I've seen is that there is no single solution that will cover all of the enterprise customers' requirements. So it's always going to be a bit of a task to assess, where have you got these security shortcomings? What products do you need? And who's going to be the best partner to deliver those products or those technology solutions for you?
And how are you designing Pointnext services to fill that need to provide guidance across this still dynamic ecosystem of different solutions? How does the services part of the equation shake out? What are you doing to make that helpful to these early adopters?
So we've obviously got technology solutions that we build. So, for example, the HP container platform, which is based around technology that we acquired as part of the Blue Data acquisition. But at the end of the day, these are products, and companies need to understand how they can best use those products within their own enterprise environment. So I'm part of Pointnext Services within the advisory and professional services team. And a lot of the work that we do is around advising customers on the best approach that they can take. So on the one hand, we'd like them to purchase our technology solutions. But on the other hand, a container-based engagement, I think, needs to have quite a high content of services-led engagement, especially in the early phases where a lot of customers aren't necessarily aware of all of the changes they're going to have to make to their IT model. So we deliver a number of container-oriented services, both in the general container implementation area, as well as more specifically around container security. So, for example, I've developed and delivered transformation workshops around DevSecOps. We've also got container security planning workshops where we can help customers to understand the security requirements of containers in the context of their environment. And a lot of this work is based around some discovery work we've done to build our own container security solution reference architecture.
Do you have any examples, perhaps, Simon, of organizations that have worked towards a DevSecOps perspective on continuous delivery and cloud-native development? What does it look like, the service deployment examples and use cases? How are people putting this to work on the ground?
Well, I think a lot of the customers that we deal with today are still in the early phases of adopting containers. So we see a lot of proof of concept engagements where a particular customer may be wanting to understand how they could take a traditional application and modernize that or re-architect that into a cloud-native application or container-based application. So there's a lot of, I wouldn't call it tire kicking, but a lot of experimentation that's going on at the moment. And a lot of the implementations that we see are, they start off pretty small. So the customer will maybe buy a single technology stack for the purpose of testing and playing around with the containers in their environment. But they have intentions within sort of 12 to 18 months to be able to take that into a more production setting and start to really reap the benefits of container-based deployments.
Over the past few years, we've heard an awful lot of the benefits for moving closer to the computing edge, bringing more compute and even data and analytics processing to the edge. This could be in a number of environments from autonomous vehicles to manufacturing and healthcare. But one of the concerns has been if we move more of our compute environment networked to the edge, that our security concerns go up as well. Is there something about doing container security properly that will make that edge more robust, more secure if we use containers across the board?
And there are obviously a lot of concerns around containers, but I think a container project done properly can actually be more secure than a traditional virtual machine environment. And this is really down to the way you can actually manage the code in the environment. And I think when you're talking about edge deployments, that rings very true, both from the perspective of the amount of resources that it would have to use. It's going to be a lot lighter when you're talking about something like autonomous driving to have a shared kernel rather than having to have lots of instances of a virtual machine running, for example. But also from a security perspective, if you deal with your container lifecycle management effectively and you involve the security guys in your team early on, and you have a process around releasing and updating and retiring container images into your registry, and you have a process around introducing security controls and code scanning in your software development lifecycle, and making sure that every container that gets released gets signed with an appropriate enterprise signing key. You really have something that is very repeatable compared to a traditional virtualized approach to application delivery. And I think that's one of the big benefits of containers is that it's very much a declarative environment. It's something that you prescribe. This is how it's going to look, and it's going to be repeatable every time you deploy that. Whereas with a virtual machine environment where you have a lot of VM sprawl and a lot of differing or changes across the different platforms as different people have connected and changed things in there for their own purposes. So I think there's a lot of benefit of this sort of tightened control in a container environment that can give you some good security benefits.
Right, that sounds very auspicious and interesting. I'm sure a lot of organizations will want to really dig into that and understand how containerization done properly can benefit them. In the meantime, given that it is still early, what comes next? How do organizations get started? How should they be setting themselves up to take advantage of containers in the right way, a secure way? What do you recommend, and are there resources that people can look to start this process properly?
I think the first step that organizations should take in order to address containers is to do the appropriate due diligence, right? So containers are not going to be for every single application. There are going to be certain things that you just can't modernize, and they're going to remain in your traditional data center in the traditional way they've been running for a number of years. So I always suggest to look for the projects that are going to give you the quickest wins and use those as proof of concepts to demonstrate the value that containers are going to be able to deliver for your organization. Make sure that you do appropriate risk awareness of those. Work with a services organization that can help you. The advantages of a service organization is they've probably been there with another customer previously, so they can use some of the best practice experiences that they've already gained to help your organization adopt containers as well. And just make sure that you approach it using a DevSecOps model. There's a lot of discussion in the market at the moment about, should we be calling it DevOps, or should we call it SecDevOps or DevOpsSec? And my personal opinion is call it DevSecOps, because security in a DevSecOps model sits right in the middle of development and operations, and that's really where it belongs. In terms of the sort of assets you can look at, I think there's plenty of information out there, and a Google search finds you a lot of assets. But as I mentioned earlier in the discussion, the NIST white paper, SP 800-190, is really a great starting point to understand not only container security challenges, but also just get a good understanding of what containers can deliver and can offer for you. At the same time, HPE, we're also committed to delivering information and relevant information to our customers. So if you look on our website and also our enterprise.next blog site, you'll see a lot of articles on there about best practices around container deployments, case studies, architectures for running container orchestration platforms on our hardware. And all of this is available for people to download and to consume at their leisure.
Well, great. I'm afraid we'll have to leave it there. We've been exploring how container-based deployment models have gained popularity from cloud models to corporate data centers. And we've learned how, in order to push containers further into the mainstream, that security concerns need to be addressed across this new end-to-end container deployment spectrum. So please join me in thanking our guest. We've been here with Simon Leach, Worldwide Security and Risk Management Practice at HPE Point Next Services. Thank you so much, Simon.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I learned a lot. And thanks as well to our audience for joining us for this sponsored Briefings Direct Voice of Innovation discussion. I'm Dana Gardner, Principal Analyst at Inter Arbor Solutions, your host for this ongoing series of HPE-supported discussions. Thanks again for listening. Please pass this along to your IT community and do come back next time.